All right, thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here for a whole bunch of reasons, but I love the opportunity to connect with different groups of people, and for the most part, I don't think I know most of you, so this is so it's a treat for me. It's also a treat because I'm standing upright, so I had a pretty bad case of food poisoning last night, and of a very unusual sort. It was like somebody injected me with histamine, and my whole body turned bright red, and I was kind of burning up. It was a very strange experience, but that's past, so I'm feeling okay right now. And I'm going to tell you about, the title of this talk is on the impact of natural disasters on biology and behavior. That's going to be sort of the very sliver at the end. So this is sort of a lot more of the setup for the studies that I'll be kind of telling you about, and which will be ongoing really for the next decade, I think. And because basically, we had this research program, a field research program offsite connected to our lab work, and we were thrown into having to consider the impact of natural disasters on our work in 2017 with the impact of Hurricane Maria on our research program, which forced us to really confront this major challenge, which I think is incredibly timely, as we'll see. So at any point, if you have questions, challenges, whatever, feel free to raise your hand and to interrupt me. So I think everyone here in this room is aware of the fact that we are currently, as a people, as a planet, experiencing a crisis, right? So climate change and all of its associated impacts are coming much faster, more forcefully, more clearly than we ever anticipated. The science seems indisputable on that. There's currently a big forum going on in Europe on this right now. And the impacts, we're all beginning, we're feeling them, we're seeing them all the time. So we can think about storms, which are like hurricanes and cyclones, which are increasing in intensity and in scope. We've had 5 Category 5 Atlantic hurricanes in the last 3-4 years, which is unprecedented, and that's going hand in hand with this being the hottest 5-year period, most likely, and hottest decade on record. And of course, just this past summer, Hurricane Dorian, we saw the devastation that it wrought in the Bahamas. So it's a huge problem for humanity that I don't think we really, understand a lot about in terms of how to deal with the impacts on people, right? We can talk about mitigation, we can talk about strategies to try to bend that curve of temperature, but let's face it, we're going to be confronting more and more of these kinds of situations and other situations that are related to increasing temperature of the planet as well. So we're all acutely aware of fires, devastating fires, deadly fires in California, in Australia. The heartland of the United States is experiencing over the last few years incredible flooding, moisture, right, that can't be held back. This has had a huge impact on everything from agriculture to human health. And we're also seeing this across the Middle East and other places where this desertification has become extreme and probably over the last decade, and precipitated the movement of large numbers of people out of these areas where they really can't survive because they can't survive by traditional agriculture. So they've been moving. This precipitated the immigration crisis in Europe, which was a foreshadowing of a lot of the reactions kind of that we're seeing in this country. So huge political upheavals, people feeling very strongly on all sides of this. So the impacts are huge, and if we take it down to a kind of from the societal level to the individual level, there's increasing evidence that these natural disasters, like the earthquake in Haiti about a decade ago, seem to be associated with lots of mental health and disorders, neuropsychiatric disorders, and neurodevelopmental disorders. So mothers who go through one of these very stressful experiences while carrying a child in utero, that child is at an increased risk for developing autism or other kinds of problems, right? So this is, the scope, goes from society at large all the way down to the individual. And, the things that we have been trying to think hard about are what makes some people and some groups resilient and able to cope with these kinds of impacts, and other individuals much more vulnerable, right? And at risk for all kinds of problems. And so a lot of our work has actually focused on the protective value of social connections. Okay, so we know from lots of different kinds of data sources that having stronger, deeper, more numerous friendships, connections with others, family is supportive, right? It helps as it's a protective factor against the development of PTSD, for example, following harrowing kinds of experiences in warfare deployment. We know the data is very clear that people who have deeper and or more numerous connections with others live longer lives, healthier lives, happier lives. They also tend to make more money. And the converse is also quite stark, which is that people who are lonely, right? Not only does this evoke feelings of physical pain, but it is the equivalent of smoking a pack of cigarettes. So it's worse than being sedentary and overweight in terms of its impact on your lifespan. Okay, so it's about the equivalent of smoking cigarettes. So having strong social ties is a really, really good thing. It's a critical part of the human adaptive toolkit. So we are specialized, like few other animals on this planet, for doing things together, right, in groups. So we can come together and work with each other to achieve things that we couldn't achieve on our own. And this has been a hallmark of the human species for probably 500,000 years at least. I always like to joke that these were the guys when they were putting up the new Comcast building downtown, but it's a little Southeast Pennsylvania humor. These are obviously Amish folk who are putting up a barn, and this is, I think, a great example of how each individual family's ability to survive and thrive depends on having a barn, but an individual can't put up the barn themselves. So the whole community comes together, they cooperate, they build the barn, right, and then they pass that on. Okay, so this is part and parcel of what it really means to be a human being. And over the last decade or so, well, probably about 15 years, neuroscience has revealed that there is a highly specialized and perhaps dedicated network of brain areas that are involved when we are dealing with other people. Okay, so this is often called the social brain network. And this includes a number of areas. We don't need to kind of walk through exactly what they are right now. But basically they're involved, this kind of starts at the back of the head, where sensory information, in particular visual information about kind of who's around you, begins to be processed, and we decode that there's a person in front of us. And these neurons kind of pass information forward, decoding successively more abstract information about those individuals. So who are they? Do I know them or not? What's their current emotional state, which is read out based on their facial expressions, body posture, tone of voice, etc. And then that information basically flows forward into two sets of brain areas that are really critical for how we relate to other people, how we manage our connections with others. So one of those is the process of emotional resonance or empathy, okay, which is this is very fuzzy looking, engaged in parts of the medial prefrontal cortex, especially the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula. So these areas are really active when we feel someone's pain or feel their reward. Okay, and that degree of activation, at least in the human brain, is do you feel my pain or my is predictive of how much will actually help somebody. I think the surprise area is the anterior cingulate, dorsal anterior cingulate. And then there's a twin process that also occurs, which is information goes into this other set of areas, including a very special area in the human brain, the temporoparietal junction, kind of up here at where the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe come together. as well as parts of the medial prefrontal cortex. And these areas are involved in kind of the more cognitive aspects of understanding another individual's mind, a process known as theory of mind or mentalizing, basically forming an internal model, an estimate of what another individual might be thinking. Okay, so what do they know? What do they care about? What are their beliefs, desires, and goals? And that's critical for determining whether we cooperate with them, whether we cheat them, et cetera. And there's obviously an interaction between these two sets of processes. So when we feel more empathy for someone, we're more likely to cooperate with them, et cetera. Okay, so that's kind of how this whole system works. By and large, everything, until the past few years, everything that we knew about this social brain network was derived from brain imaging in human subjects, so people lying in MRI machines, measuring blood flow, hemodynamic bold signal that's recruited to these areas when you are making various kinds of decisions or perceiving other people while lying in an MRI machine. Structurally, we know that basically the health and integrity of this social brain network is related to how many connections you actually have in the real world. So people who have more friends have these areas are bigger, thicker, and the connections between them are much more, they're higher fidelity because they're stronger, basically. Okay. It was even true about a decade ago that that kind of health and integrity of the social brain network predicted how many friends you had on Facebook. Now, I don't think that's really true anymore because of all of the absurdities of Facebook and bots and all the weirdness that's going on there. But 10 years ago, it was kind of a real way to connect with people. The upshot is, if you have lots of friends, you've got a well-functioning social brain network. This doesn't tell us the really critical question. Okay, it doesn't tell us the answer to the really critical question, which is whether this is destiny, like you're born with a high-functioning social brain network. It's wired up really well, right? Good connections, good strong connections between these areas and the neurons within them, and so that makes you able, willing and able to make lots of friends, or whether this is something you can build. I'll return to that question later. Now, this social brain network and the need and capacity to connect with others to thrive in life is a biological heritage that we share with our non-human primate relatives. In particular, we know a lot about these fellows here, rhesus macaques. So rhesus macaques are basically the number one non-mouse model for human biology and behavior going back about 100 years. And these critters are really fascinating, and I've been working with them for about 25 years. They share a lot of the same features of their social behavior and especially their biology with us. So these animals live in large multi-male, multi-female groups. They spend a lot of their effort and a lot of their time cultivating friendships and alliances with others. Okay? And when you have a strong connection with another monkey, that monkey is more likely to help you, okay, when you need help, especially in an aggressive interaction with another individual over some territory or food or something like that. And we know that now, and we've done a lot of this work, monkeys who have more social capital, right, who are more integrated into society, who have more friends, live longer, okay? They have more babies, so they're more successful, right, just as we see in humans. Okay, so it's critical for their success as well. And what we now know, or beginning to uncover, is that rhesus macaques, macaques in general, have a homologous social brain network to our own. Okay, so they basically have the same sets of brain areas wired up in more or less exactly the same way that we do. Okay, and as we'll see, literally the connections between these areas and the thickness within them, which indicates kind of the connections amongst the neurons within these areas, is predictive of how many connections, how many friends a monkey has, just like we see in humans. And in fact, to get back to that question of whether it's destiny or something that you can develop, it's actually both. Okay, so the critical study is done by collaborators of ours at Oxford, who basically took macaques and I guess I'm supposed to stand in a particular place here because they're recording it, who took macaques and who were living alone, okay, in the lab, scanned their brains to map out the health and connectivity of this social brain network, and then put those monkeys into different size groups. Okay, so some monkeys had to learn how to get along with one other monkey, some with 2 or 3 or 4 or 8 in this study, all the way up into about 32 monkeys in other studies. Let them live like that for a few months, bring them back into the lab, scan their brains again, and what you find is that, in fact, literally here we're looking at the volume within an area that is homologous to this temporal parietal junction, really critical for theory of mind that I told you about before. It scales linearly with the number of monkeys that animal had to figure out how to get along with, right? How many individuals do you have to remember? Do you have to be able to make predictions about? Do you have to understand their motivations, goals, and their your prior interactions with them? Okay, so this tells us that at least to a certain degree, this network is kind of like a muscle that you can exercise. We know that there are differences between individuals at birth. We can look at the extremes, right, in disorders that are characterized by social impairments like autism, schizophrenia, and we know that this network is diminished, okay? But nevertheless, at least in kind of typically developing individuals, the more you exercise it, the more you use it, the better developed it becomes, which also predicts that they're going to be more skilled and more motivated at interacting with others. Now, as I said before, almost everything we know about the social brain network comes from imaging studies in humans, but clearly within any of those particular blobs of hemodynamic activity live tens or hundreds of thousands of individual neurons like these in this nice rainbow here. And each of those neurons obviously can do different kinds of things, right? It can have a different morphology, it can express different receptors, use different kinds of neurotransmitters, collect information from different areas and project to different areas, right? So if we really want to get down to the mechanistic level and understand how this thing all works, we have to go beyond what we can do in human brain imaging studies. And so that's where the beauty of this macaque model really comes in, because this affords us the opportunity to get inside the brain, to get down to a deeper level, both in terms of understanding how these neurons work and encode information, and also manipulating the system so that we can test our hypotheses about their functional contributions, right, to behavior. And over the last decade, our group and several other groups have really worked out that there's a strong correspondence between the areas of this social brain network that are involved in emotional resonance, something like empathy, right, are very similar and live in similar areas in humans and in macaques. Okay, so this is a sagittal section through a human brain, through a rhesus macaque brain. So imagine you cut my head down this way, pulled off this side, and you're looking in. And we have been particularly focused in this area right here along the anterior end of the corpus callosum, the anterior cingulate gyrus. And both in humans, this area is active when we are considering what's happening to some other individual, whether they're receiving financial windfall or they're experiencing pain. These signals are elevated. This emotional resonance signal is elevated when that person is closer to you, when they're family, a friend, same ethnic group, right, and they're suppressed, diminished when it's somebody who you don't know who's from a different ethnic group. And we and others have basically found that we see something very similar to that at the level of individual neurons and their spiking activity. And you can kind of characterize it this way, which is that what we've identified is that most of the neurons in this area are like mirror neurons for reward or for punishment, okay, for experience. So these are neurons that respond the same way when the monkey himself gets a reward and they respond the same way when the monkey sees a friend of his get a reward. Okay, so they are essentially computing another individual's experience through something like simulation, right? A filter that simulates what that individual is experiencing through one's own experience. And this is a long-standing theory in psychology. That's how we understand how another individual feels by kind of filtering it through our own experience of the same kind of thing. This is happening at the individual neuron level. And our data in monkeys shows that the higher the fidelity of these signals, the clearer they are, okay, the more likely the monkey that we're recording from will actually help another monkey or give him a reward. Okay, so they seem to have an important functional role in behavior. Now, this other part of the system that's involved in forming a mental model of another individual's mental state, their beliefs, goals, and desires, is associated with the temporal parietal junction in humans, and that was thought to be uniquely human until very recently, where some brain imaging data had suggested that, in fact, there's a part of the monkey brain, the superior temporal sulcus, that corresponds to the human temporal parietal junction. Okay, it basically has the same connections as the human TPJ. And we had long known from the work of Doris Tsao and Dave Perret and Charlie Gross that there are neurons in this part of the monkey brain that are involved in social perception. So these are neurons that respond quite selectively. Here's 200-some neurons responding to different faces, okay, and they respond very strongly, but they don't respond to other kinds of complex objects. Okay, so they seem to be exquisitely specialized for signaling that there's another person in front of you, right, or another monkey in front of you. But it remained unknown whether this same part of the brain actually contributes to something more complex beyond just perceiving another individual. And we showed some years ago that neurons in this area also contribute to one of the most fundamental aspects of perspective taking, or of theory of mind, which is perspective taking, basically understanding and orienting your attention in the same direction that another individual does. Okay, so this is something that we showed 15 years ago that monkeys do with the exact same temporal dynamics that humans do. It's a behavior and a process that emerges early in human development, so sometime between 6 months and a year of age. Babies begin to orient their attention in the same direction as their caregiver. This is critical for learning language. It's critical for beginning to take the perspective of another individual and understand what they know or what they see. And we know that it falls apart very early in disorders like autism, okay, with kind of cascading effects on difficulties with learning language, communication, et cetera. So we showed that neurons in this monkey superior temporal sulcus, which we think is the homologue, okay, the same thing as the human TPJ, signal when a monkey is going to shift his gaze in the same direction as another monkey. And if we chemically inactivate those neurons with a drug that shuts neurons down, it's not something we can do routinely in humans, then monkeys no longer do that. They no longer shift their gaze where another monkey is looking. They no longer shift their attention in that direction. So this impairs their ability to take the perspective of another individual. So beginning to build a case that this part of the brain is involved in more than simply perception. And we have ongoing work, which I'm not going to describe now, showing that this part of the brain in monkeys is critical for economic cooperation. Okay, it's that there are neurons that are specialized for cooperating with other individuals. Okay, and we've found that using EEG recordings from the scalps of humans playing the exact same game that we have monkeys playing, that this part of the brain is engaged and actually resonates between two human players when they cooperate. Okay, beginning to build that connection, okay, between these signals at the single cell level, okay, and what we can measure in humans in terms of their interactions. So now I want to take, after that long build-up and a short description of some of the basic science we've been doing, I now want to put that in the context of this talk, which is the impact of natural disasters on biology and behavior. And for the last 12 years or so, we have been privileged to work. We've had an ongoing research program at this site here. This is Cayo Santiago Island off the northeast coast, or the east coast of Puerto Rico. It's a beautiful place. It's relatively small. There are two islands connected by an isthmus between them. And this is an amazing natural laboratory where currently somewhere around 2,000 rhesus macaques are free living on this island, doing whatever they want, okay? Without interference, without IACUC, making sure that they're healthy, happy, et cetera. All right, there is an eye cook in place, but these animals are otherwise, they're basically unperturbed. And they were first deposited there in 1938. I'm not sure why that's not playing. Whoops, sorry. Maybe it'll play. No, there we go. So there were 400 precursor animals or founding population brought there in 1938 from India. This is descendants of those animals. 6 years ago, they're basically doing the same things. They are allowed to fight with each other, compete over resources. There's no management of which individuals mate with whom. There are at any time somewhere between 6 and 12 groups of animals on the island that range in size from 50 monkeys to 400 monkeys. Okay, and the population density on Cayo Santiago is very close to what you see in Manhattan and Beijing. Okay, so it's not on the order of what you see in Mexico City, but it's a lot denser than what we see here in Philadelphia. And these monkeys basically they spend a lot of time doing this, which I alluded to before. Just two monkeys engaging in grooming. This is the equivalent of you going and having a beer with a friend or coffee or something, and kind of talking about your, what's really bugging you. So they spend almost all their time doing this whenever they're not eating or fighting, okay, or mating during the mating season. And monkeys who spend more time doing this are closer and they're more likely to help each other out. Okay, so this is their one major component of their social capital. The other is their dominance rank, and their status is jointly a factor of how many friends they have, and if you're male, how big you are. Okay, so those are the two major factors that determine your social capital. And when monkeys have, basically, this is really, really important for them because when they're not grooming or mating or eating, they're doing this. So they spend a lot of time fighting. They're fighting over territory. They're fighting over mates. They're fighting over access to preferred grooming partners. And they do this all day long. So we have, for the past 12 years, as I said before, had a research program there where I have staff who are down there, who are out there on the island every day. So this is going to loop on forever. You guys won't pay attention to me, you'll watch them. So I have staff down there who go out to the island every day. They take censuses to see who's alive and who's dead and where are they, because monkeys get killed or monkeys die overnight often. They do focal animal follows, which is basically the thing you worry that Facebook or Amazon is doing with you, but it's not quite doing that yet. So basically, they follow each individual monkey for 10 minutes at a time and record every single thing they do with every single other monkey that they encounter. And then they cycle through the whole population so that over years we can get 10, 20, 30 hours of data on each animal at various times of day in various seasons under various conditions. From that data, we can do a variety of things from the behavioral data. So this is an example of using social network analysis to map out the connections between monkeys. This is like Facebook for monkeys. So this is for one particular group, just the adults, based on grooming in 1 year and the subsequent year. So the way you read this is that the squares are females and the circles are males. And the ones who are at the center are the really popular monkeys. So they have lots of friends, right? And their friends have lots of friends. As you get out to the periphery of the network, you can see monkeys who have basically one connection, one grooming partner. That's it. And then there are these other animals out here who basically are solitary. And they just kind of follow the group around. Okay? And a monkey's position in the social network year to year tends to be pretty stable. And actually found that it's heritable. So a monkey who is in the center of the social network is very popular. His or her offspring is likely to have that same kind of position in the group later. And that's true even if they move to another group. So that's critically important. So males emigrate from their natal group just around sexual maturity, and they have to find their way into another group. If their mother was popular, so she had the skills and the temperament, she to have that kind of place in society, then that male is much more likely to as well. Okay, so these are these are social network maps based on other behaviors. This is fighting. You can see everybody fights with everybody, and this is based just on proximity. We've been developing other tools to try to come to a much deeper understanding of the phenotypes, okay, the constellation of behaviors, behavioral traits that actually predict having strong social ties with others, as well as other features of their behavior. So this, you don't worry about the details. This is a machine learning approach, basically data-driven approach, looking at the ways in which various kinds of behaviors, frequencies of different kinds of behaviors go together across the population. And essentially what you find is there's something like, and depending on which way we do the analysis, somewhere between 6 and 10 phenotypes, if you will. 6 and 10, you call it personalities, for lack of a better term, okay, and they are characterized by different things. So these are monkey. This is a phenotype that's basically a monkey tries to stay away from other monkeys, okay, walks around a lot, scratches himself, fear grimaces, so sort of fearful, subordinate. These are monkeys who are just antisocial, and they spend most of their time scratching themselves, grooming themselves, and eating, and that's it. There are other phenotypes in here that are very highly social. All this purple stuff is aggressive, and the green is affiliative. And you can see that here, this phenotype S10 is a highly social phenotype. Okay, they're really in the mix with other monkeys, and based on these kinds of data-driven phenotypes, just like social network position, shows some heritability, that there's a genetic component to it. Okay, so. Excuse me. So this is heritability, and we can see that especially for a few of these states, and it's states that tend to involve a lot of different kinds of social behaviors, that there's a genetic component to this. So it's heritable from parent to offspring. We've spent a lot of time examining social behaviors, their development, and their distribution across the population to determine the degree to which it corresponds to what we see here in the laboratory, right, that we can measure kind of much finer scale but with fewer animals, and how well that maps onto what we see in humans. Okay, so this is looking at development of gaze following, right? So this is that primitive foundational component for perspective taking, and this is over the course of the first year of life, and this is amount of time following the gaze of another individual, of a human experimenter. We can see that it begins to go up, although there's a considerable individual variability around, sometime after 6 months of age. Okay, and we also see that it peaks in adolescence, just exactly as you see in humans, and it declines with age, which is exactly what you see in humans. Okay, so this sort of age-related profile mirrors what we see in our own species as well. And we've also found that this gaze-following response, perspective taking, varies with social status as well. Okay, and so this is something that we first demonstrated in the lab about a decade ago. This is new data showing that basically, which mirrors what we found in the lab, that low-ranking animals tend to be much more attentive to other animals and to follow their gaze than high-ranking animals are. And this has also been reported in humans. Okay, so people tend to follow the gaze of other individuals who seem to be more powerful, right, or who are more powerful, like politicians. Okay, so human beings in the laboratory will follow the gaze of politicians, but they don't follow the gaze of your sort of average Joe. All right. Now, this is a beautiful setup in terms of the behavior. We've been collecting this behavioral data for 12 years. It builds on 70 years worth of behavioral and demographic data that had been collected by our precursors working on the island. And at the same time that we initiated our study, we also began collecting blood and other samples, biological samples from these animals, because essentially every fall we have a monkey rodeo, and we round up as many monkeys as we can. We typically get somewhere around 400 of the animals, and we can obtain samples like blood, which we are getting DNA from. We've got DNA on more than 1,000 monkeys. We can get CSF. We can get other kinds of samples. And initially, we were trying to, very crudely map candidate genes or SNP panels onto, that we, in terms of variation in genetics across these monkeys, onto variation in their social behavior. But over the last couple of years, it's become inexpensive enough for us to just go all out and sequence the entire genomes of these monkeys. And so we've sequenced the entire genomes of about 300 monkeys, carefully selected to be not related, and that's an ongoing project. But about it must have been 2016, we were confronted with a problem on Cayo Santiago, which was that for some reason, still unknown, the population had begun to skyrocket in size, and it was rapidly outpacing the carrying capacity of the island, and something had to be done about it. And there was going to have to be probably at some point contraception implemented. That was something we didn't want to do because that would really screw up the sort of natural situation that we were examining, kind of actually being able to observe evolution in process. But it also necessitated removing animals from the island. Okay, basically culling, which hadn't been done since the 1970s. The University of Puerto Rico did not have the capacity to maintain these animals in perpetuity, so this gave us an incredible opportunity, essentially, to make lemonade out of lemons, and very carefully and in a very controlled way, remove animals from the population and actually sample all of their biological tissues. So in 2016, we targeted an entire social group of monkeys for removal. We intensively observed their behavior to phenotype them for about 6 months prior to the actual culling event. We removed the animals. They were all euthanized one by one, and we extracted their brains. And so half of the brain, the right hemisphere, was drop fixed in formalin. And all of those hemispheres are off at Oxford University, where they're being scanned at high resolution with MRI, DTI, and then they'll come back here for histological analyses. And they will go into something that we've created called the Cayo Santiago Biobank, which will become an accessible for researchers tissue repository and data repository. So anybody who's interested can come to us and get these samples or get the data. And already there's at least 24 research groups who are accessing what we've got, and they're generating incredible stuff. So half the brains were fixed, and so they're going through a really fancy kinds of data processing in terms of imaging by my colleague Jerome Soleil, who's at Oxford, and also moving on to Lyon in France. And what's really, I think, very promising, and this is data from 2016, and from a small number of individuals, but we actually have the brains now from about 400 monkeys, is that we're seeing the same kinds of effects in terms of the size and connectivity of this social brain network being related to various aspects of social capital, so that they had observed in the laboratory, for example, by forcing monkeys to learn how to live with different numbers of other monkeys, or what we had seen in humans in terms of the health and integrity of this social brain network, predicting how many friends you have. So in this medial part of the brain, the anterior cingulate gyrus up here, we see that there's a really nice correspondence between how big this area is, how thick the cortex is there, and how many friends a monkey has, how many grooming partners they have. Okay, which is what we had seen before in the experimental study. And the same thing for this middle STS region, which is, we think, the equivalent, the homologue of the human temporoparietal junction. Okay, now we also see that there are other parts of the brain, subgenual ACC, which that we'll be very interested in, and the orbital frontal cortex that are related to social status. So if you're a higher status animal, these areas are bigger. Okay, this is just very, very preliminary data, but we are very heartened that we've now, for the first time, seen in a almost wild, population, that spontaneously occurring variation in social capital and social integration are associated with variation in the structure of these brain areas. More recently, Jerome has found that if you look at now the kind of the wiring between some of these areas, that there is a major effect of social dominance on the connections between basically the front and back of the cingulate cortex, which is really important for regulating a lot of social behaviors and for decision making in general. I'm just really setting you up for what we've got and how it's going to be really cool when we actually begin to dive into the data collected post-hurricane. So as I said before, we collected lots and lots of DNA, and we've been using just whole genome sequencing to identify the variation across this population. We've identified some 93 million variants. That's a lot, right, to start kind of from scratch. Where do you start? Given our interest in social behavior, one of the things we've been doing is looking at the overlap with the Safari database. There's different versions of this now, but these are basically genes that have been implicated in autism in humans, and there's some 700 or so that in which there's a good overlap between the variants we've identified in rhesus and what's been implicated in autism. And there's only about 50 or so that seem to be predicted to be high impact. Okay, so we've kind of been focusing on those. And we've found that we do get variation, significant variation in a number of these genes that have been very strongly implicated in autism in humans. And so this sets us up for a very nice look at whether these animals show any of the kinds of differences, right, from typically developing that you see in humans in terms of different kind of social behavior, maybe different kinds of social communication, whatever. For what we might find, here's some work that we had done about 5 years ago, basically mapping onto this social network variation in two genes that are important for regulating serotonin function. So one is important for the production of serotonin, and the other is for mopping it up from the synapse. Okay, and basically the monkeys who are colored red here have the double whammy. They have kind of the quote-unquote bad variants for each of these genes, so they have putatively lower functioning serotonin system, and they're systematically on the outskirts of this social network. Okay, so which is, I think, a very nice correspondence to what you see in humans as well. Now, to tie all of this together, okay, genes, environment, to brain structure, to behavior, the other half of that brain, the left hemisphere, we flash froze in thick slabs. Okay, they're in the middle, of an island in Puerto Rico, and those are in -80s here. And we are now using a variety of different techniques, ATAC-seq, RNA-seq, and doing single-cell versions of this to try to understand how variation in gene expression and the regulatory elements that allow genes to be expressed at higher or lower levels might actually provide that connection between what you've got when you're born into the world, your genetic endowment, the situation you find yourself in, and ultimately your behavior. Okay, so this is something that we're taking samples across many different areas of the brain, especially involved in social behavior and some control areas. And again, this is just a very, very preliminary demonstration that not only can we distinguish different brain areas based on patterns of gene expression, but a couple of these areas, especially the anterior cingulate gyrus and the caudate nucleus, even amygdala, are that we see upregulation of a lot of these important genes, and that's very heartening to us. Now, we haven't connected all the dots yet, but again, just showing you what we can hopefully do. Okay, so let's now get back to the topic of this talk, which is the impact of natural disasters on behavior and biology. And as I mentioned earlier, Hurricane Maria, which is a Category 5 storm, slammed into Puerto Rico in September 2017. It hit Cayo Santiago Island first. Okay, so everything that the people of Puerto Rico experienced in terms of destruction of habitat, of places where they lived, distribution of food, medicine, water, right, disruption, loss of social partners and friends, actually happened to the monkeys on our island as well. Here's just to show the eye of the storm passing over Cayo Santiago right here with almost 200-mile-an-hour winds. You can see the difference from satellite imagery from a couple days before the hurricane, nice and green, after the hurricane, right, completely brown. We're very concerned about our staff as well as the animals, so we hired a helicopter to fly over about 2 days after the hurricane, and you can see that it looked like a bomb went off there. Okay, all of our research facilities were destroyed. All of the plant life was more or less defoliated. Okay, this windward side of the island continues to look like that, so it's completely brown. There are no leaves anywhere. Whereas the leeward side, is recovering a little bit. If we look at greenery up until, it's very healthy up until the hurricane here in the red line, and then boom, there's basically not a single leaf left on the island. This is important food for the animals, but it's also important for shade. So it's actually about 8 degrees hotter on Cayo Santiago Island now. So this is something that we as human beings are having to contend with. And that led to a big spike in deaths, just as we saw with the people of Puerto Rico. So this is the death rate kind of bouncing around up until the hurricane. There's a huge spike in deaths. It's not the storm itself. Monkeys basically weathered the storm, but they began dying in high numbers for a few months afterward. They were eating seaweed. They were drinking seawater because the water distribution systems were completely destroyed. It took a while to get back in place. It was dangerous. There was debris everywhere, sharp metal everywhere. And they had lost a lot of their partners. So this is the setup for where we are right now. So this was 2017. We have continued to collect behavioral data. We've continued to collect other kinds of samples over that time period. And we have, with NIH funding and NIH support, continued that culling process over the last 2 years, which we will be continuing out for another 5 years. Don't look so sad. I mean, it is a sad thing, but it is also an incredible opportunity. There's no database like this on the planet, and this is not something you can really do with human beings, but provides a microcosm for what the people of Puerto Rico have experienced and continue to experience. I mean, there's an incredible spike not only in deaths right after the storm, but mental health syndromes, suicides, depression, PTSD. There's tons and tons of articles on this, and we don't know why. I mean, we can speculate. We don't know what's protective, what's not, how that gets under the skin. But I just want to leave you with I guess I'm not going to leave you. Well, it depends on whether we stop on time. Given everything I've kind of said about the importance of social support for weathering a storm, it's really interesting to look at how at least one group of these monkeys has responded to this incredible acute and chronic stressor. And what we found is something really quite amazing. So this is another map of a social network of one group. This is now animated through time, and what we're looking at here is social network density, basically how close everyone is and how many partners they have. And you can see that, and this is after the hurricane, it begins to go up, and this is what we call, this is a measure of equality. So it's based on the Gini index, which was developed to explain inequality in different countries, okay? And what we find is that monkeys are becoming tighter knit. They are less, they're much more equitable in the distribution of their social capital. So they're becoming more friendly with more monkeys. They're becoming a much more tolerant group. Okay, now we haven't unpacked the data yet for other groups to determine whether there are differences, variation across groups, which would be super interesting. But this is, when I talk about this with people who've been through natural disasters and trauma like that, that's what people talk about. It's like, oh, after the tornado, we all, the whole town came together and we helped each other out, but that's not sustained. We've seen this now, this pattern, sustained for the 2 years. Okay, since that storm, which I think is very remarkable. Yeah, question.
So I'm looking at the curves.
Yeah.
It goes up and then down.
Coming down.
So that one stays down, the one on the bottom stays down, the one on the top is starting to went up and then it's starting to come down. So
I just don't have an updated animation plot for you because basically this is just going to bounce around like that.
just stay up and the other one
Yeah,
is going to stay
that's
down.
right. And this one is basically, by equity, it's we're looking at the number of individuals that you interact with as a function of the possible partners that you could have. And we also see that whereas before the storm, monkeys show a very strong preference for interacting with kin, and they're going to be their closest allies and friends, we see that beginning to dissipate as well. So they're much more They're just friendlier to monkeys who are not their relatives. Yeah.
Yeah, when you showed the subtypes of the different types of behavior,
Yeah.
you had them grouped into, I forget the term, but like affiliative and antagonistic social behavior.
Yeah.
Here you're showing that affiliative social behavior tends to go up. Do you see a corresponding decrease or increase in like the antagonistic social behavior? Or
We just haven't analyzed that yet.
Okay.
It's a great question. Yeah, you might expect that if you are just in tighter quarters, there's an opportunity to be friendly, but also compete more over.
Yeah, I mean, I think either result would be really.
I mean, anecdotally, we're finding less competition
Yeah.
over resources. I mean, but this is unusually, difficult set of conditions. Yeah, and then I'll get back on the talk. Yes?
Did you consider the observation of death as an event?
Observation of death. You mean a monkey seeing another monkey die? No. You mean death in general or specific animals?
You talked earlier on very much about the interaction, with the response
Yeah.
to gaze and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And this is a pretty traumatic event in itself.
It is.
It's a close individual. I just wondered whether.
It's a really great question, and I love the question. I hadn't thought about it. We published a paper like about 5 years ago showing that monkeys on this island respond to the death of a close friend, comrade, relative in much the same way that you see people. So, and so it's actually even more interesting than that. So, in this case, what happened was one monkey was sort of, he was a beta monkey. He's not quite top ranking. He was attacked by other top ranking monkeys and killed. And then there was kind of like contagion. So monkeys who were not friends of that monkey basically tortured the corpse for about an hour. It was just clearly the animal was dead. But then after those animals moved on, the friends and relatives of that monkey came by and they sat there. And it's very hard to describe it in non-anthropomorphic terms. Grooming the body, sitting there looking, sullen. These are hard. It's hard to do scientifically, but it's exactly the kind of behavior you see in humans. When people see that in animals like chimpanzees, they say, "Oh, of course, they're experiencing some kind of grief, and that has a big effect on them." And we see the exact same kind of behavior outwardly in rhesus macaques. So I'd love to. That's actually a really. I'd have to look and see how we can operationalize that, but I think it's an interesting question. Question here?
Say something about food sources before and after.
Their food is a combination of provisioned food, just because there's so many monkeys on the island. When they were left to their own devices, they ate everything on the island. So it's about half provision and half natural foodstuffs. So after the hurricane, clearly there's been very little in the way of natural foodstuffs. And they were very resourceful. As I said before, they were eating seaweed, and they were actually drinking seawater for a while, which was pretty difficult. Yvette?
I was wondering, you showed data about increasing flexibility depending on how many monkeys they were housed with. And I was wondering if that occurred whenever you did that, or did it have to be in adolescence? In other words, did you take middle-aged monkeys?
Yeah.
House them with a lot more monkeys, more flexible?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a great question. So those studies were done by our colleagues at Oxford, collaborators. Those were juvenile to young adult animals. So they weren't like infants, but I don't know. They were relatively young. So we don't know how much plasticity there is later in life at all. It's a great question. They should do that study. Yeah. Yeah.
I have two questions. First one is, was there any indication of selective mortality for the monkeys that were loners or the ones that were more aggressive, more likely to survive or die, and like in some way explain that?
Yeah, no, this is an awesome question. Again, it's not been pulled out of the data yet. Great question.
And the second question is, it has to do with the social brain and the increasing connectivity with with the number of people that you're exposed
Yeah.
to, and just thinking about the course of human evolution and increased
Mhm.
and urbanization, where over the course of human evolution, the context that we have
Yeah.
has increased exponentially. Is
Right.
there a point at which those exposures tops out and then it starts to have an adverse effect on the brain?
This is an awesome question. I mean, yes, you're right that by all estimates, humans spend most of their evolutionary career in groups of 40 to 100 people. So that was about the number of social stimuli you had to pack into your social brain. And now some of us are encountering thousands of people, even in daily life, let alone online. I think it feels intuitively obvious that there's no way that you could just keep expanding like that, and there has to be. Now, I don't know whether there's a negative impact as you keep expanding that social network. It probably depends a lot on your temperament as well. There's a whole set of questions here, right, that we could ask that are, I think maybe you're getting at related to, what we're seeing in terms of the increased rise in anxiety disorders and depression, especially in young people. And, there's been a lot made of social media and comparison culture and things like that, but I don't think there's good hard data on that at all. We're after one. I had a little tiny interlude to tell you about, but that's related to some of our other efforts to try to take these kinds of insights and what we're driving in the lab and push those into management practices in business, but I think I'll instead let you all go on and get back to work or whatever you're doing. But I do want to kind of leave you with one thing, which is, it's kind of fascinating that, there's a nice op-ed in the New York Times by Darren Aronofsky yesterday about Greta Thunberg, who's become the emblem, the face, the Madonna of the climate, change movement. And it's kind of ironic, right, that you have a person who actually, has autism, who's become the face of this movement, where really we have to get beyond the partisanship that's currently making it impossible to get anything done in order to do something to mitigate our own vulnerability to these kinds of disasters. And I think the way we do that is by connecting with each other. And if you want to hear more about that, I can tell you more about it later. But it's important to acknowledge the fact that I don't do all this work. That my social network, some of whom are here, but there's a much larger group who actually are the people who do the work, who go out to the field, who do things under really incredibly difficult conditions, and without them, none of this would be possible. So, thanks for your attention and the opportunity.
I want to thank Dr. Platt for a wonderful talk. And
Oh, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.